seeing later on. We have here already an ectoderm. We have the neural tube very well formed, containing neural epithelia, which is the stratified ciliated columnar epithelia. On the lateral to that, we have the paraxial mesoderm that organizes to form the somites. And this paraxial mesoderm will comprise of here we have the dermatome. We have, in this position here, we have the myotome and then the sclerotome. So from this, the neural cells which have not moved very far eventually produce central processes that go to the neural tube, connecting the dermatome to the neural tube on the dorsal part. And therefore, this becomes the sensory part. And then from the ventral part of the neural tube, we have the myotome here producing chemical substances which induce the neuroblasts within this basal part to grow a peripheral process that connect to the myotome and the myoblasts, so that we now have the skeletal muscles being innervated by the segment of the spinal cord. So all these play a role in terms of the formation of the neural tube. We had said the ectoderm was producing bone morphogenetic protein, which also helped in the dorsoventral differentiation, what you call dorsoventral polarization. In this slide, when we were discussing yesterday, this is the ventral part, and this is the internal matrix, and this becomes the external matrix, or also this part here is the intermediate. Now what happens is the cells from the internal matrix migrate outwards to form a cortical plate, and those cells in the cortical plate can also undergo mitosis, and therefore this continue to form the layers of the cerebral cortex or the layers of the cerebellum. That's why we said the outer part usually is made up of gray matter, and the inner part is white matter. And what remains after all these cells have migrated is the ependyma that lines the ventricles. During the first migration of cells, we say they form an intermediate layer. That intermediate layer forms this cluster of differentiating neuroblasts that we refer to as ganglionic hillock in the case of the cerebral cortex. In the case of the cerebellum, they form the nuclei of the cerebellum. So the ganglionic hillock here will differentiate eventually to form the basal ganglia. We also said that at the most roof plate, at the attenuated part of the roof plate, we have invagination of cells and the pia mater forming the choroid plexus. So this is an invagination into the ventricles, forming the choroid plexus for the purpose of formation of cerebrospinal fluid. And then in the mesencephalon, we said the cells grow very fast. So in the diencephalon, the cells grow very fast also in the thalamus, and this is what we have in the case of the thalamus. We're going to look at these structures later on. This is the choroid plexus, invagination of the pia mater together with the blood vessels and epithelial lining forming the choroid plexus. This is at the roof plate where there is a very thin attenuated area. We also talked about congenital malformation, failure of the fusion of the neural tube, the anterior neural pore, posterior neural pore. When there is failure of fusion, then we have an open bag, right from the brain area to the open bag. We talked about anencephaly, but in this case, the entire vertebral column, also the arc of the vertebral column, is not formed, and therefore the nerve tissue is exposed to the outside. That we refer to as cranial rachis. These are just examples of cranial rachis. And then at the outer, the most anterior part, where the anterior neural pore fails, If only the anterior neuropode fails, then we have anencephaly. These are just examples of the same. Now here we talk about, you'll find some people with some protrusions, especially in the head region, and those protrusions can be having either fluid only, cerebrospinal fluid only, or cerebrospinal fluid and nerve tissue. So we talk about meningoencephalocele. Encephalocele, we're talking about brain area. Brain area. So here we have meningocele, where we have only the meninges protruding into the part of the skull which has not formed. And remember, the skull forms from neurocrest cells. Skull tissue forms from the neurocrest cells. But where we have both the fluid and the meninges and also the nerve tissue, then we talk about meningoencephalocele. Meningoencephalocele. Or you might have fluid, but there is the ventricular cavity also protrudes into that area. Meningohydroencephalocele. Hydro because it has water. It has a part which is cerebrospinal fluid. So these are some of the congenital malformations that we have, especially in the head region, where you will notice protrusion. These protrusions can be in several areas. The protrusions can be in several areas, can be the occipital, cervical region, the frontal region, between the nose and the frontal part, the temporal region, sphenomaxillary region, sphenoorbital region, frontoethmoid region. All these are examples of what you have as protrusions. When you look at this, these are the occipital region. When you look at this, this is frontonasal region. When you look at this, this is a frontal protrusion. And just a CT scan of the same, you can notice here some nerve tissue, the meninges protruding into this herniated part of the skull. So usually where there's a problem with the development of the brain, there will also be accompanying development of the skull tissue. This one is orbital, you can see affecting the orbital region. Now, so that those are the congenital malformations that we have. But if you remember in the spinal cord, we have spinal bifida occulta, spinal bifida cystica, and also tethered cord, a tethered cord. Now let's look at the spinal cord. The spinal cord, like we said yesterday, develops from two sources. It develops from the lower part of the ectoderm, that forms the primary neurulation. It also develops from the secondary neurulation, where you have mesenchyme tissue transforming and becoming neural tissue, acquiring a cavity and becomes neural tissue. That mesenchyme tissue then differentiates from mesoderm and becomes neural tissue. So the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum, part of the skull, all the way to the conus medullaris, what you call conus medullaris, the tip of the spinal cord. In an adult, the spinal cord extends up to the region of L1, L2. L1, L2, the lumbar region. In the child, when the child is born, it might be up to the level of L4. And this is because of the growth of the vertebral column vis-a-vis the growth of the spinal cord. Remember yesterday we talked about if there is failure of the secondary neurulation, then you might have the tethered cord, which is going to stretch the sacral segments of the spinal cord and also the coccygeal segments. So as we go up towards the cervical region, we have the spinal cord, the spinal segments, the spinal nerves emerging almost at the same level as the vertebra. But as we move down, remember after L2, we do not have any spinal cord because the conus medullaris terminates at that L1, L2 section. So what we have there are still spinal nerves which were emerging at the various levels of the vertebral column, the vertebral foramen, at the vertebral column. In that area, we'll be having a cluster of spinal nerves. And these spinal nerves we now call the cauda equina. It's like a tail of a horse. That's why it's called cauda equina. So they are not coming at the same level as the segment to which they originate from. This is the spinal cord. From here, this from the brain. At the foramen magnum, just below the medulla oblongata, we now have the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is covered by meninges. It's covered by meninges. Between at the vertebral canal and the spinal cord, we have the dura mater. And there's a space which we refer to as epidural space. Epidural space. And then after that, between the dura and the arachnoid, we have a subdural space, which is a potential space. It doesn't exist much. The dura and the arachnoid are very close together. And then between the arachnoid and the dura, the inner part, below the arachnoid, we have subarachnoid space, which contain cerebrospinal fluid. After that, very closely attached to the spinal cord is the pia mater. It's attached to the spinal cord and protect the blood vessels as they penetrate into the spinal cord. That's the pia mater. Now, between the vertebra, that's in the vertebral canal, and the dura mater, we have a venous plexus. So we have a very well-developed venous plexus. I think that will be addressed in gross anatomy. We also have two enlargements in the spinal cord. We have a cervical enlargement at the cervical region. And this cervical enlargement is because of the extra nerves that supply the upper limb. Extra nerves supplying the upper limb. And then we also have a lumbar enlargement. At the lumbar enlargement, these are extra nerves also supplying the lower limb. So in the areas which are supplying the neck and also the rest of the trunk, the spinal cord is slightly narrow. And usually either rounded or oval in shape. For the blood supply, I'm just mentioning, but the gross anatomy people address it. We have the anterior spinal artery, a single anterior spinal artery formed from vertebral arteries. So vertebral arteries, each vertebral artery gives a branch which then unites to form the anterior spinal artery. That supplies the anterior part of the spinal cord and occupies the space next to the fissure, anterior fissure. We also have paired posterior spinal arteries, which occupy the sulcus. We have a sulcus. That's a depression, and we'll be addressing that later. And that is where we have the location of the paired posterior spinal arteries. And from this, the most cranial part of the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries also gives a branch. They also originate from the subclavian artery as thyrocervical part, which now gives rise to the vertebral artery. The other segments of the spinal cord are from the descending aorta. These segments from the descending aorta form what you call radicular vessels. Radicular vessels that supply the various segments of the spinal cord. Like I said, we have an internal venous plexus, and an external venous plexus. What you need to remember about these venous plexus, both internal and external, is that they do not have valves. They do not have valves. So blood can be able to move from right from the abdominal cavity into the venous plexus, and from the venous plexus to the abdominal cavity. This could be a source of migration of cancerous tissue into the vertebral column. Say from the breast, somebody having a breast cancer, you can have actually cancerous tissue moving into the spinal column and all the way to the brain. Similarly, for prostate cancer, you can have the same. So we have talked about these enlargements, cervical and lumbar enlargements, which you need to note. Now, as we look at the structure of the spinal cord, it is made up of covered by meninges, like I've said, and the spinal cord consists of white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside. White matter on the outside and gray matter on the outside. But we need to also to note some important features. You can be able to identify the anterior part of the ventral part of the spinal cord by looking at this fissure. Remember, when we talked about the neural tube, we said we have a roof plate and also a floor plate. So this is a very narrow part here, that it was the floor plate, and this is a narrow part that was forming the roof plate. Connecting this, we refer to this as a commissure, connecting one part of the hemisphere, one part of the spinal cord to the next, right or left. You can identify the ventral by a fissure, that means a crack-like opening, and on the dorsal part, you can identify it by a septum. So we have a septum on the dorsal part and a fissure on the lateral part. Then we also have on the dorsal part sulcus. A sulcus is a depression, mainly two sulci. We have a median sulcus and then a lateral, ideolateral sulcus. These are the areas where you have the blood vessels next to them. That is for the external part. Now, each of these spinal cord segments will have a spinal nerve with a dorsal root entering into the dorsal part of the spinal cord, and a ventral root, which you said is motor. So the dorsal is the ala, going to what was the ala in the case of our neural tube, and the motor originates from the basal part of the neural tube. So this dorsal root and the ventral root join together to form a spinal nerve. So a spinal nerve consists of sensory fibers that enter the spinal cord at the dorsal part and motor fibers that leave the spinal cord at the ventral part. So we have dorsal and ventral roots. Each of those roots are formed by rootlets. So the rootlets join together to form a root, a dorsal root or a ventral root, either leaving or entering a specific segment of the spinal cord. In the case of the cervical region, we have eight spinal nerves. In the case of the thoracic, we have 12 spinal nerves. In the case of the lumbar, we have 5 spinal nerves. And in the case of the sacral, we also have 5 spinal nerves and 1 coccygeal nerve. So a total of 31 segments. Now, for the gray matter, first for the white matter can be divided into the 3 parts. We have the dorsal column, we have the ventral column here, ventral column, and the lateral column. The dorsal column, ventral column, and the lateral column. These contain ascending and descending fiber tracts. ascending and descending fiber tracts. The fiber tracts taking the information to the brain and taking the information from the brain, specific parts of the brain, to the spinal cord. So these are the columns. We'll revisit this again as we look at the specific areas of the spinal cord. Then we have the gray matter, and gray matter comprises of cell bodies, aggregates of cell bodies. These aggregates of cell bodies, like we said, in the case of the central nervous system, we talked about them as nuclei. This has a segment. This is the gray matter, and this is the white matter. This has been stained for myelin. That's why this is showing myelination. This is the ventral fissure, and this is the septum. So in histology, this is what you are supposed to look at. So the gray matter is this butterfly-shaped structure that developed from the mantle zone of the neural tube. This part here developed from the ala. This part here developed from the basal part. So the ala and the basal part. And then the roof plate and the floor plate now divided this into right and left parts. So we have a right part and a left part. Each of these contain aggregates of cell bodies representing specific parts of the body. Specific parts of the body. Very close to the dorsal, we have the dorsal ganglia. So we have a ganglia, spinal ganglia. Spinal ganglia is a relay, contains cell bodies of the pseudounipolar neurons that are sensory going to the ulnar plate. And then the basal plate will be having neurons supplying the skeletal muscles. In this area here, we normally have interneurons also connecting the sensory part to the motor part. We call them interneurons. So that's what we will be looking at shortly. This is an example of what you have as in the gray matter, aggregates of cell bodies. Aggregates of cell bodies. For the neurons of the spinal cord, we have several neurons types. Radicular neurons, those leave the spinal cord. Like the motor neurons, alpha motor neurons from the basal part, those leave the spinal cord. Those are motor neurons supplying the muscles. We have the autonomic, and the autonomic originate from the intermediolateral and medialis. If you remember when we talked yesterday, we talked about sulcus limitans. Sulcus limitans was separating the ala from the basal plate. Now, this area here, between what was the ala and the basal plate, contain neurons for the autonomic nervous system, especially in the thoracolumbar region, that is from T1 to L1, and also from the sacral region for the parasympathetic as S2, S3, S4. We'll be looking at that shortly. So the type of neurons, we have radicular neurons, also for motor and autonomic, and then we have those endogenous neurons. Those ones do not leave the spinal cord. Interneurons could be like endogenous neurons. They connect various parts of the spinal cord or cross the midline. When they cross the midline, then we refer to those as commissural neurons. We have the association neurons connecting the same part of the spinal cord. And then intercalated, these are cell bodies in what was the ala, the sensory part, in what is referred to as the bodies in the gelatinosa. Then commissural cross the midline. They cross from one part of the from the right part to the left side, contralateral. So they move to the contralateral before they can either ascend or descend. Then we have the Renshaw. These ones are important. Renshaw neurons, which synapse to the motor neurons. So they can inhibit the activity, and these are very important in regulating the movement of the body. Spinocerebellar tracts, those ones are from the spinal cord to the cerebellum, and these ones are mainly from the dorsal part. For the gray matter, we have the nucleus with different names, several types of nuclei, and this nuclei, let me just not go into specific names, but the nuclei represent origins of the fibers that are going to either ascend or descend. Nucleus dorsomaginalis are propiospinal fibers from the propiospinal, from the receptors in the joints, and these ones are now going to send the information to the upper part. Substantia gelatinosa is mainly from the upper part, where you have from the ala, in the ala region. These are mainly spindle cells, something that dendritic tree. We'll talk about dendritic tree later on. Similar to what we have in the cerebellum. Nucleus propria, so the spinal tract, and we'll be looking at the tracts. So you note spinothalamic tract that is able to send the information to the thalamus temperature for crude touch, and temperature. That's very important. So once we know where they are, then we can be able to understand if there's any damage in the spinal cord, we lose those particular functions. Nucleus dorsalis, this one's from the muscle spindle apparatus, this on the dorsal part. Anything dorsalis has a relationship with the sensory. So these are afferent from the muscle spindle apparatus. These ones regulate, these ones detect the tone within the muscles, and therefore can be able to, through the ventral part now, through the interneuron, influence either the relaxation of the muscle or contraction of the muscle. Intermediolaterales, now this intermediolaterales, the intermediate part, represent mainly structures from the autonomic nervous system. Structures from autonomic nervous system. I also want to put out that in these gray matter areas, the gray matter areas has been divided into regions, what they call rexens. These regions represent the various parts of the body. The various parts of the body. You can note here from the foot to the hip, the most lateral part is far away from the center. So the neurons here would be representing the foot, the neurons here would be representing the hoof, the hip. So you can see the arrangement. And therefore, if a blood vessel supplying this area is affected, the foot will not be affected, but the hip will be affected. So that's what you need to understand, that the gray matter, and this is what we are calling somatotopic representation. Somatotopic representation. Okay, we talked about somatotopic representation, and that's what is important for you to know, that there is one-to-one mapping, topographic mapping. The body is mapped onto the part of the brain or the spinal cord. So as this ascends, from these cell bodies, they go now to these other parts of the spinal cord and ascend. The axon, which will be lying in this white matter, will then ascend to the brain into either the somatosensory part of the cerebral cortex through the thalamus. But we'll be looking at that somatosensory later. So this is what we have now. The gray matter is divided into a dorsal horn, a ventral horn. Dorsal horn, remember, is sensory. the subventral horn, which is motor, and sometimes you will have a lateral horn. We'll show you a lateral horn. A lateral horn representing the areas of the autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic in thoracolumbar, that is from T1 to L1, to thoracolumbar, and also sacral. S2, S3, S4 will have a lateral horn. The other parts do not have a lateral horn. I would also like you to note, using this particular section, the proportion of the gray matter and the white matter. Notice here, we have a lot of gray matter, relatively smaller white matter, and this is in the lower parts. This is in the sacral part, the lower parts of the spinal cord. As we move towards the cervical region, then the gray matter becomes proportionately less than the white matter. This is because every nerve, every spinal nerve that enters into the spinal cord, we will have an ascending axon that takes the information to the brain. And therefore, as we move from the sacral to the cervical region, we have an additional number of spinal nerves, and therefore additional amount of white matter relative. So this is just representing somatotopic representation, which I talked about in terms mapping of the body. Now, we have sensory pathways, and those sensory pathways are in the dorsal column. The dorsal column, also what we call the lemniscal system. In the dorsal column, if you remember, I talked about this part here being the dorsal column as white matter, or dorsal funiculus. We use the word funiculus because it has fascicles. Lateral funiculus and the ventral funiculus. So dorsal, lateral, and ventral funiculus of white matter. Let's now look at this dorsal column. The dorsal column contains axons that are very important in detecting what we refer to as epicritical sensation, detecting fine touch, vibration, very fine vibration, and fine touch. That's what we have in the dorsal column. That's what we call the epicritical, representing epicritical sensation, or the lemniscal system. Lemniscal system. We have two parts of the dorsal column. The most medial is called funiculus contain fascicles. These are groups of axons. So we call those fasciculus gracilis. So this most medial part is fasciculus gracilis. This one, the axons in this area originate from the lower part of the body below T6, below the sixth thoracic segment of the spinal cord. So from C7 or T7 all the way to your foot, sacral region. These ones will be in this area. So if you cannot detect with your foot those fine touch or your skin below that region, then this part has been affected. This part has been affected. And then the most lateral part, above T6, we have those axons lie on the lateral part of fasciculus gracilis. We call them the fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus cuneatus. The fasciculus cuneatus are representing the upper part of the body from T6 all the way to the neck region. So with your upper limbs, you can be able to feel something, whether it is silk, very fine, or it is cotton, you can be able to differentiate. That's what we refer to as discriminative touch. You can be able to discriminate your sensations. So that is gradient of discrimination. So that way, that is touch, vibration, something is walking on you, a flea or something, you can be able to detect that using the fibers that carry that information lie in the dorsal column, both fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. These fibers act as first order neurons. They act as first order neurons. They enter into the spinal cord, they cross to the opposite, they now go up to the medulla oblongata, where we have another group of cell bodies that this synapse with. So those form the second order neurons. But we'll be talking about those later on. So this is what we have as representing the dorsal column. Discriminative pressure, discriminative touch, fine pressure. However, we also have crude touch. So that crude touch is in the anterolateral column, what we call spinothalamic tract. They are carried by the spinothalamic tract. Spinothalamic tract. That is crude touch, crude when you pressure something, vibrations. That one there, you cannot distinguish different modalities or different gradients of what you are touching. Whether it is rough or smooth, you cannot be able to distinguish that. So that is carried in the anterolateral column, or what you refer to as spinothalamic tract. Now, to be able to do that, this is pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure. All these are transmitted through the spinothalamic tract in the anterolateral column of the white matter. Okay? Now, what is the unique about these axons? Remember that in the lemniscal system, the one we just looked at here, what we need is, for very fine touch, you need the information to be transmitted very fast. So the information is transmitted fast, and therefore the diameter of the neurons will be larger. There will be very few synapses, and most of it will be parallel arrangement of synapses, and very few synapses. In the case of the general sensation in the anterolateral column, we have very many synapses. The transmission is slow, and the diameter of those neurons are less. The myelination is not as well developed. Because remember when we talked about yesterday, we said that myelin sheath is very important in fast transmission of the impulse apart from the diameter. So these ones are not as heavily myelinated compared to what we have in the dorsal column. So we need to note that. Now, here we have different representation. In the white column, we talked about them. They represent afferent and efferent ascending and descending tracts. Afferent and efferent ascending and descending tracts. The tracts within the white column, I said, go to the brain, so they will carry spino something. The prefix spino is where they are originating from, and where they end up is the next part. So we have spinothalamic tract. That ends up in the thalamus. Spinotectal, that ends up in the tectum. spinocerebellar, that ends up in the cerebellum. Those are ascending tracts. But within this area, we also have descending tracts coming from the various parts of the brain to the spinal cord to regulate functioning of the body. And this will include corticospinal tract from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. And these ones influence the motor neurons in the ventral column. And we have so many other examples which we'll be looking at shortly. So we have said fasciculus gracilis represents the lower body for epicritical sensation. Fasciculus cuneatus represents the upper part of the body for discriminative sensation, what we call epicritical sensation. And these are in the dorsal column. Anterolateral column, more ventral column, we have spinoreticular. This mainly for touch, temperature, pain. This reticular is going to the reticular formation. And reticular formation is very important in your consciousness. So from the spinal cord, some fibers go to the reticular formation. Anterior spinocerebellar, from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. These ones are proprioception, detection of from the muscle spindle apparatus, within the muscles, Golgi tendon apparatus. So these ones will be carried through spinocerebellar to the cerebellum so that you can have change of movement or muscle tone. Posterior spinocerebellum, spinothalamic, sorry, posterior spinothalamic. These, we have posterior and anterior, but posterior spinothalamic, mainly from L2, this passes again to the thalamus, and that's very important. Spino-olivary, we are going to look at the olivary nucleus within both the medulla oblongata and the pons, and this is going to the olivary nucleus, which is very important in fine-tuning movement. Fine-tuning our movement, and also through the olivary nucleus, fine-tuning our hearing. Spinothalamic, mainly for touch, temperature, and pain, but this is crude touch, crude temperature, and pain. Now, when you talk about touch and deep sensitivity, we have different modalities. Discriminative touch, 2-point discrimination. For example, that's in the dorsal column. Stereognosis, being able to, even when you hold something, you can be able to determine how heavy it is. You're able to discriminate that. Position sense, when something is walking on your body, you can be able to say this is a flea or this one here is a cockroach, because it's putting a pressure on the body, and therefore you can be able to see how fast it's moving. You can be able to detect that. Vibration sense or pressure, that is also very important. Being aware of the shape, the size, and the texture of what you are touching, that is very important. So all these are because of the sensory receptors within the skin, which enter into the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord, it then goes to the thalamus, which is a central sensory relay center. It enters the spinal cord at the dorsal column. And then from that, we have the descending fibers. I've talked about the dorsal column. And the dorsal column, very important in discriminative touch, pressure, vibrations, and so on. Now, I said the next part where the dorsal column synapse, the second order neurons, originate from the medulla oblongata. So when they enter the medulla oblongata, they synapse with the cell bodies of the same names. So fasciculus gracilis in the medulla oblongata, they now synapse with the nucleus gracilis. Fasciculus cuneatus synapse with the nucleus cuneatus in the medulla. Then they cross over. The second order neurons cross over. The ones on the right cross over to the left. The ones on the left cross over to the right. At the position of the crossover, that we refer to as decussation. Decussation. So those fibers which cross over form something like an arch. So we call that arcuate fibers. And those fibers are carrying sensory information. So we refer to that as sensory decussation. Sensory decussation. When you go to the medulla, we'll be able to see that as sensory decussation. From the brain, we have fibers which descend. These are motor pathways. They descend to the spinal cord, influence the efferent from the spinal cord to the effector organs. So these are descending motor pathways. We have the lateral corticospinal tract originating from the cerebral cortex, area 1, 2, and 3, or what we call the motor part of the primary motor cortex, lateral corticospinal. Remember here, it is cortical where it originates from, spinal where it terminates. These lateral corticospinal tracts, at the region of the medulla oblongata, the fibers cross over. The ones on the right cross to the left, and the ones on the left cross to the right. So that we call decussation. But these fibers are going to influence the basal part of the ventral horn, which is motor. So we refer to that as motor decussation. And this group of fibers within the medulla oblongata form what we refer to as the pyramids. They form a pyramid. These are enlargements within the ventral part of the medulla oblongata that is now referred to as the pyramid. We'll be looking at that when we look at the medulla oblongata. The other fibers are rubrospinal from the red nucleus, again for fine-tuning movement. Reticulospinal, remember we talked about spinal reticular, spinal reticular, which is going to reticular formation, which also influence motor activity. Vestibulospinal, very important in our neck movements. Neck movements, when we see an object, we hear an object, we hear an object, we turn our heads to see the source of the information, of the sound. This is through the influence from the vestibulospinal fibers. Tectospinal, this is going from the tectum, either for medial neck reflex, mediate neck reflex, both because of sound and also because of sight. When you see an object, you can turn your head to track an object as it moves, or you can turn your head to the source of sound. All that is from the tectospinal. Vestibulospinal is very important in your neck regulation of movements, and therefore be able to balance the head in position. We have looked at this before. I think just to illustrate the gray matter and the white matter and the locations of some of these fibers is what I had looked at earlier. But just for us to know where they are so that we can be able to see what can happen, we will turn to the first picture at the end of this class. Here we have various parts of the spinal cord. Notice a very clear lateral horn. So we have the dorsal horn, the ventral horn, the lateral horn of the spinal cord. So a very clear lateral horn. Notice also the proportion of the gray matter and the white matter. Here we have more white matter than gray matter. That means we are at a higher level of the spinal cord. Here we have a lateral horn, very distinct lateral horn. That means we are either within T1 up to L2, where you have the sympathetic, the autonomic nervous system. That's why we have this lateral horn. Here, the proportion of the white matter is relatively larger than the gray matter, but we do not have a lateral horn. That means we are at a position above T1. So we are in the cervical. So this is a cervical segment of the spinal cord. This is a thoracic segment of the spinal cord. So you can see the difference. And then as I was talking about these ascending and descending tracts, the dorsal column, the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, we talked about them as forming the dorsal column, representing the nasal system. We have the anterolateral part here, and within that, we have the spinothalamic tract, both ventral, anterior spinothalamic tract, vestibulospinal, tectospinal, fibrospinal. You can see most of these are descending fiber tracts. Descending fiber tracts. We have lateral corticospinal tract and anterior corticospinal tract. Now, just looking at this, you'll be able to note that both ascending and descending tracts are within areas of the spinal cord, but they are sort of separated functionally. So there's a functional separation. Just to show what we've been talking about, if you look at this, you have quite a lot of white matter compared to the gray matter, a very distinct lateral horn. So here we are in the sacral region, And in this sacral region, part of what you see here, these are actually part of the spinal nerves that form the coda equina. Now, a commissure is a connection. So here we have the gray matter connecting the right and left. So that's a gray commissure. Here we have white matter connecting right and left. So these are white commissure. Note the anterior spinal artery, and then on the posterior, we have also spinal arteries in the posterior. Substantia gelatinosa, this is where we have these axons with some sort of dendritic trees. A lot of dendrites. That's why it call about dendritic trees. So that's about our spinal cord. That's about our spinal cord with the spinal nerves. And I've said every spinal nerve carries both sensory information and motor information. Sensory information from the body, that is somatic. Sensory information from the organs. Motor information to the body, and also motor information to the organs. Each spinal nerve will be carrying some autonomic fibers to the sweat glands in the body. We'll be looking at that when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system. Now, we talked about several fibers, endogenous fibers and so on, but we have neurons which cross the midline in the gray matter and in the white matter. So those neurons whose axons cross the midline, we call them commissural. Those neurons from the cell bodies connecting the dorsal column to the motor part, we call them interneurons. Those neurons connecting either the motor part here, projecting to the other parts, we call them projection neurons or association neurons. So that we need to be aware of, and then also to be aware that the spinal cord is covered by meninges. These are meninges, the dura, the arachnoid, and if you notice here, you can see a narrow space. This is the subarachnoid space containing cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid. And because this part of the dura, as the spinal nerves live, they are surrounded by dura mater as they live at the vertebral foramen. They are surrounded by dura mater. Each of the dorsal root spinal nerve will be passing through a ganglia. So we have dorsal root ganglia. That's one. And also, we said the spinal nerves will have spinal rootlets. So we have several dorsal rootlets, several ventral rootlets that join together to form the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve. And then outside the dura, here we'll be having a venous plexus, vertebral venous plexus. So that is what you have. So if this is the sacral region, if you are in the cervical region, like what we have here, or you are in the thoracic region, like what we have above T6, here we can see very distinctly the septum, and then there's a separation here. There's a sulcus, there's a separation here from this. So this part here is fasciculus gracilis, and this part is fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus representing the axons of the dorsal column. Now, we talked about the blood vessels supplying various parts of the spinal cord, the dorsal part being supplied by posterior spinal arteries, the ventral part being supplied by the anterior spinal arteries. So, what would happen if you have lesions? These lesions could be transection of the spinal cord, either trauma, where you have compression, lesions, following accidents, the vertebral column. Remember, the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column, but when we have inner fractures of the vertebral column, then there might be compression of the vertebral column, and that is trauma. The other thing that could happen is ischemia, and in ischemia, you can have lack of blood supply to a specific region if a specific blood vessel is damaged. If a specific blood vessel is damaged. Now, we therefore have various conditions. If the anterior spinal artery or posterior spinal arteries are damaged, and therefore this part of the posterior does not receive blood, then that is the dorsal column. Then what would happen is you can be able to touch something, you still can feel temperature, you can still feel pain, but you lose that fine touch. you lose the fine touch, which is necessary for being transmitted by the dorsal column. So if you have a section of the spinal cord, complete transection of the spinal cord, then the part distal to that transection is the part which will be damaged. If you have transection, say at the level of S1, the sacral part, sacral segment S1, then the part supplied by the spinal nerves distal to S1 will have loss of sensation. In this case, most of your bowel movements, the micturition, also defecation will be a problem. So you will end up with the urinary and fecal incontinence. Incontinence is where you are not able to control your micturition or defecation. But suppose you have partial transection. That means you cut, say, only this anterior part here, or the blood supply to this anterior part is cut. Then remember, you will have motor loss, and therefore you will have paralysis. Motor loss and paralysis, but you are able to still feel, discriminate things. If you have a central means this area here, only this part here will be affected, and therefore you are still able here to feel, because that is carrying fine touch, because that's not affecting the dorsal column. That's why you have a hemisection of the spinal cord. If on the other hand, the spinal cord is transected at the level, cervical level at C1, then you will have paralysis of the phrenic nerve, and therefore you cannot survive. You know, phrenic nerve, the phrenic nucleus is in the cervical region. So if you have paralysis, then our diaphragm does not contract, you cannot be able to breathe, and therefore you have loss of life. So most of the lesions depend on the area which has been affected. The anterior parts of the spinal cord, if it's affected, then you have loss of motor activity, loss of pain and temperature. You cannot be able to feel anything. You cannot be able to distinguish like joints. And this is because that part, remember the anterolateral part, the spinothalamic tract, and all that is important. And then the posterior part, of course, is what we talked about. Central, the medial region here, if you have that, then you can have mostly weakness in the upper limb. Remember what we talked about the first diagram we had, where you are talking about regulation of the lymph movements here at this central part in the sacral region. So that is very important for you to note that during your examination of a patient, you can be able to see at what level do you have injuries. That is the spinal cord. Now we have what we call Brown-Sequard syndrome, and that is hemisection. Hemisection, either ipsilateral or contralateral sections. But you also need to remember that as the fibers come from the brain, they cross over, both sensory and motor. They cross over. The sensory decussation for the dorsal column, what you're calling the medial lemniscus, after the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. And then the motor decussation in the medulla, the corticospinal tract crossing over at the lower part of the medulla after the pyramids. And that is also very important for you to know that you will have either contralateral or ipsilateral lesions as compared to what we have when we have the brain. So that is the spinal cord. Like us now, the spinal cord is continuous with the brain at the medulla oblongata. At the medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata is part of what we refer to as a brainstem. As a brainstem. If you think of the spinal cord as a root, then we have the stem. After the stem, we have the branches and the leaves. So the other parts of the brain, the cerebellum, the cerebral cortex, the diencephalon, derivatives, all those could be considered as branches and also the leaves subsequently. So the brainstem here comprises of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. Here we are looking at the median section of the brain. With this part, the spinal cord has been cut. This part here is the medulla oblongata, originating, remember, from the myelencephalon. This part here is the pons, originating from the metencephalon, and this part here is the midbrain, originating from the mesencephalon. So these parts constitute what you refer to as the brainstem. From this brainstem, we have attachments to the cerebellum and also attachments to the thalamus or derivatives of the encephalon and also the cerebral cortex. Those attachments we refer to as the pendangos. And pendangos consist of axons. Transmitting information to those organs or from those organs through the brainstem. So you'll notice here that the brainstem is actually a highway through which information is being transmitted to the spinal cord, and information from the spinal cord is also being transmitted to the cerebral cortex, the encephalon derivatives, and also the medulla oblongata. And information from these organs are also being transmitted through the brainstem. So we can talk about it as a two-way highway. In this two-way highway, we usually have what you call the roof, and the roof is the part above the ventricle. So that we refer to as the tectum. The part above the ventricle is the tectum. And we have the colliculus, what you call colliculus, in the midbrain, forming part of the roof. So when we talk about pretectal nucleus, or from the colliculus, then this is what we are talking about, the roof. Then we have the ventricular cavity, and the ventricular cavity in the brainstem will comprise of the Sylvian aqueduct in the mesencephalon, remnant of the mesencephalon, and the fourth ventricle. Sylvian aqueduct and the fourth ventricle represent the ventricular cavity. Then the basal part, below that, we have pendangos. Pendangos in the case of the medulla oblongata, pendangos in the case of the pons, and also pendangos in the case of the midbrain. This, like I've said, consists of axons, taking the information to the various parts of the brain. In the case of the medulla oblongata, the basal part contains pyramids. Then we have the tectum. The tectum comprised of ascending fibers and also the descending fibers and reticular formation. Reticular formation, we'll be talking about reticular formation later, and the cranial nerve nuclei. Within the midbrain, we have the periventricular gray matter forming part of the tegmentum, sorry. Now, cranial nerves are originating, the nuclei of the cranial nerves originate from the midbrain, brainstem, or are associated with the brainstem. If you divide the cranial nerves into four, we shall have 12 cranial nerves. And these 12 cranial nerves can be divided into four. The first and the second are only associated, the brainstem, but don't originate from the brainstem. The oculomotor and the trigeminal nerve and the trochlea, oculomotor and the trochlea originate from the midbrain. The trigeminal nerve, the abducens, facial, and vestibulocochlear originate from the pons. The nuclei are in the pons. And the rest of the cranial nerves, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, accessory nerve, and hypoglossal nerve, originates from the medulla oblongata. So that's where we have the cell bodies, and these cell bodies are within the tegmentum of the brainstem. If you remember what we talked about yesterday, we'll be looking at cranial nerve specifically, but if you remember what we talked about yesterday, we have that ala plate, the basal plate, and these nerves originate from what was ala plate, basal plate, and also part of that autonomic area, which we talked about on either side of the sulcus limitans. So let's look at the medulla oblongata. This is the medulla oblongata. Here we have an anterior fissure, a deep depression in the anterior part. The medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. So those ascending and descending tracts in the spinal cord also are found within the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata also contain this elevation that we refer to as the pyramid. These contain axons from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord that we refer to as the corticospinal tract. Remember we talked about corticospinal tract in the spinal cord. Here we have a depression, a sulcus, lateral median sulcus, and we have the olive. This is what we call the olive, and the olive consists of large aggregates of cell bodies forming the olivary nucleus. The olivary nucleus, the inferior olivary nucleus. These aggregates of cell bodies is where we have the origin of the olivospinal tract. So from the olivary nucleus, axons go to the spinal cord that regulate movement. We also have axons from here going to the cerebellum, because cerebellum is important for movement. In this region, you can see that the depression is shallow. This is because at this area, the fibers cross over. From the right, they cross over to the left, and from the left to the right. This is the area of decussation of fibers. Decussation of the fibers. So if we take a section through the spinal cord at this position, This will, through the medulla oblongata at this position, this will look like what we have in the spinal cord. If we take a section here, this is at the area of the decussation, then we will see the fibers crossing over. So this is the motor decussation area. And then this is the mid-olivary section, just to show what we are talking about. So let's look at this medulla at various sections to see exactly what we have. We have talked about the median sulcus, the decussation, the pyramids, the ventrolateral sulcus, which gives rise on the lateral side to the olive, where you have the olivary nucleus. And then we also have lateral to that, or the origin of the hypoglossal nerve, accessory nerve, vagus nerve, and glossopharyngeal nerve. Their cell bodies are in the tectum. We'll specifically have a session where we look at these spinal nerves. Cranial nerves. The dorsolateral part, if we look at the dorsal part, which is also continuation from the spinal cord, in the initial part, the lower part of the medulla oblongata, we have fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, which is continuous with that of the spinal cord. But this terminates at the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. This is at the open part of the medulla oblongata, the part which is opening to the fourth ventricle. At that position, we have fasciculus gracilis and nucleus gracilis and also nucleus cuneatus. At the most rostral part, most caudal part, between the pons and the medulla, this is where we have the 8, 7, 6 cranial nerves between the pons and the medulla. So that's where we have the origin, where the cranial nerves emerge from. But these cranial nerves, part of this, the 6th, the 7th, these ones originate from the pons. Now, the function of the medulla is regulation of the autonomic activity of the body. It has centers important in breathing, respiration, so it regulates the breathing, our normal breathing rates. It also regulates our cardiac functions, the digestive function, which is autonomic, the swallowing functions, the vomiting functions. And these, remember, swallowing, vomiting, a lot of this is also a function of the vagus nerve because it contains the cell bodies for the vagus nerve. The heart rate, because it contains ascending fibers from the thoracolumbar region that are going to synapse with the nuclei of the reticular formation within the medial part of the medulla. But it's also a conducting pathway, like I've said, a highway connecting various parts of the body, including micturition. Here we are looking at the lower part at the level of decussation, where we have the fibers crossing over from the pyramid. The fibers cross over to the opposite. So if you're in your brain, remember the lateral corticospinal tract, which you looked at in the case of the spinal cord, this is continuous also in the medulla, but here we have a crossover. And this is the area of motor decussation. Motor decussation. So they cross over and form the pyramid. So these are the corticospinal tract from area 1, 2, and 3 of the cerebral cortex. So if you have damage on the right part of the brain, then you'll be paralyzed on the left part of the body because the fibers cross over at this position. So we need to know that. As we move higher, this again is the area of motor decussation where the fibers cross over to form the pyramid. The lateral corticospinal tract crossing over. And here we have fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. We have not gone to the open area where we have the fourth ventricle. So gracilis and cuneatus, these are still fiber tracts. And again, being a continuation of the spinal cord, we have the spinocerebellar tracts, reticular tracts, and all those are located in these white matter areas. As we move more cranially, again in the tegmentum, we have origin of the cranial nerves, the hypoglossal nerve, which is purely motor, originating very close to the midline, and then the others, the most sensory, originate from the lateral part. Here we have fibers that are crossing over. That is the sensory decussation, which we talked about as the fibers from the dorsal column. The fibers from the dorsal column, from the nucleus gracilis and nucleus, from the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus after the nucleus, they cross over, and then we have the acute fibers. At the mid-olivary, what do we see? In the mid-olivary, we have the olivary nucleus. So this enlargement is the olive. What you see physically outside is the olive, and this is containing this serpentine arrangement of cell bodies forming the olivary nucleus. And here we have the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, and those fibers cross over to form the medial lemniscus. This crossing over forms the arcuate fibers. Arcuate fibers. They form an arch as they cross over. So this is what we are talking about as sensory decussation. Sensory decussation. So at mid-olivary, this is what we look at, what we see. Both the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, and those fibers now cross over ventrally to form the medial lemniscus. And this, remember, carries the epicritical sensation. For the pons, the word pons means bridge. It's bridging between the medulla oblongata, it's bridging between the cerebellum, so it forms a bridge, and connecting to the midbrain. These structures, which connect the pons to the cerebellum, we refer to as the pendulums. The pendulums. They consist of axons. I'll just demonstrate those pendulums shortly, but they are pendulums. Pons also gives origin of the cranial nerve nuclei. Origin of the cranial nerve nuclei, the trigeminal nerve, the abducens nerve, the facial nerve, and vestibulocochlear nerve. The facial nerve has several origins. It has a motor origin. It also has an autonomic origin. and has a sensory origin. Sensory for spatial taste sensation. So these ones are three nuclei we talked about yesterday, but we'll address this when we're looking at the cranial nerves. We'll come back to look at the cranial nerves, but you need just to note that they originate from the pons and their cell bodies are within the pons. From this vestibular cochlear nucleus, the most cranial part of the pons will also be having some axons that are carrying sensation for hearing from the cochlea. So those will arrange lateral to the medial lemniscus and form what we call the lateral lemniscus. The lateral lemniscus, and this is what we'll be able to see in the case of the midbrain. Functions of the pons include arousal because it contains reticular formation, cardiac reflexes, circulation, sleep, micturition, and this is what we are talking about, the pontine micturition reflex center, but also plays a role in breathing. Most of these are within the reticular formation nuclei in the area of the pons. We said pons is a bridge. It's connecting to the cerebellum, connecting to the midbrain, connecting to the spinal cord. And this connection is through the pendangles. So we have the inferior cerebellar pendangle, and this inferior cerebellar pendangle receives information from our ear, also the olivary nucleus, with transmitting information from the ear, olivary nucleus, to the cerebellum. But it's also transmitting information from the cerebellum to the spinal cord. Cerebellum to the spinal cord, so that this can regulate our movements. The middle cerebellar pendangle carries what you refer to as pontocerebellar tracts, which we'll revisit. Pontocerebellar tracts. And then the superior cerebellar pendangle carries information from the spinal cord through spinocerebellar tract, and also transmits information from the nuclei of the cerebellum to the midbrain and other areas of the spinal cord of the brain. We'll be looking at the cerebellum to look at these various parts of the cerebellum, but this, you need to know this, that we have pendangles connecting the various parts. So, we have several types of fibers passing through the basal part of the pons. Remember, this is close to what we were looking at in terms of the open part of the rhombencephalon. We have the midline here, and immediately after the midline, we have the medial longitudinal fasciculus. If you see any word fasciculus, that is axons, fascicles. The medial longitudinal fasciculus contains axons or contains neurons that connect the various cranial nerve nuclei, connecting the various cranial nerve nuclei. That's what we have as medial longitudinal fasciculus. That's what you need to know. These are longitudinal fibers. Those are longitudinal fibers that run from the midbrain pons to the medulla, but containing those fibers. The other longitudinal fibers are the fibers that end up in the pons. From the cortex, cerebral cortex, we have the corticopontine fibers. Corticopontine fibers. From the cerebral cortex, we have fibers also, corticospinal fibers. The corticopontine, corticospinal, and then corticobulbar. These are tracts that connect the spinal cord that terminate in the cranial nerve nuclei. These ones are from the cortex. So those ones form the basal part of the spinal cord. And then we have transverse fibers. The transverse fibers, what you see here, running transversely, these are fibers originating from the nuclei of the spinal of the bones, forming the pendangles. So these form the middle cerebellar pendangle. That continue to the cerebellum. They originate from the cranial nerves, from the nuclei in the bones. So in general, we have longitudinal and transverse fibers. Longitudinal and transverse fibers. Apart from this, remember we talked about the brainstem being a highway. We have also those fibers originating from the other parts of the body that are continuing on to the spinal cord, or continuing on from the spinal cord to the cerebellum, or spinal cord to the cerebral cortex. Bones, I've said, has origin of the cranial nerve nuclei. So we have the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and so on. So this is what we have as the bones being a very important bridge for fiber tracts connecting the various parts of the brain, but also containing the pontine nucleus. Now, we talked about the nuclei originating from the bones as being the trigeminal nerve, the facial nerve, abducens nerve, and so on. Now, for the facial nerve usually will have axons that come to surround the abducens nucleus before emerging. At that region, we have a hammer-like structure within the lumen, and that hammer-like structure is what we refer to as facial colliculus. We'll stop there at the bones. We'll continue with the midbrain later on. So I invite any questions at this level. Any questions? Put them in the chat. Fine. Now, in summary, I've said the brainstem consists of the tectum, the roof, and the tegmentum, the ventricular part, and then the tegmentum, and the basal part. And the basal part contains fibers originating and ascending from the various parts of the spinal cord to the brain, various parts of the brain. And then the basal part, then the tectum contains nuclei of the cranial nerves, which we have talked about, and we'll be able to revise that. Fine, I see one question.
Tunasikia mzini, na unajua mzini.
Remember the basal part is what you're talking about as having those major fibers passing through the basal part here. That's where we have the major fibers passing through. But in the tegmentum that's the middle part here. The tegmentum contains, again, like the lateral corticospinal tract will be the tegmentum before eventually emerging on the ventral part here. Decussation, the word decussation is a crossing over. It's an area where you are crossing over. Decussation, we have two types of decussation. We have the motor decussation and also sensory decussation. Motor decussation and sensory decussation. If you remember, when you are talking about the medulla oblongata, we talked about in case of the medulla oblongata, we talked about motor decussation. The motor sensory decussation here is where we have sensory fibers from the dorsal column crossing over. They cross over from the right to the left side of the medulla oblongata. So that we refer to as the sensory decussation. When they cross over, they form the medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus. Again, in the case of the medulla oblongata, we talked about sensory, sort of motor decussation, where the fibers, the corticospinal fibers, cross over from one part, as in the pyramid, they cross over from either the right to the left, or some fibers cross from right to left, some cross from left to right. And that is what we are calling the motor decussation. Motor decussation. So at this motor decussation, those fibers are crossing over from the pyramidal tracts. They cross over before going to the spinal cord as corticospinal tract. Corticospinal tract. So that's what you are calling the motor decussation, as opposed to sensory decussation. We'll also have fibers from the vestibulocochlear now, and those ones cross over also to form what we refer to as the lateral lemniscus. Lateral lemniscus. So in the midbrain, we'll be talking at this most close to in the midbrain, we'll be talking about the lateral lemniscus. We also have fibers as we go to the midbrain that are very important from the head region. Sensation from the head region, crossing over from the opposite, and those we refer to as the spinal lemniscus. So we need to note that we have fibers crossing over both sensory and motor. The ascending and descending tracts. When you talk about the spinal cord, remember we have fibers passing from the spinal cord to various parts of the brain, terminating in the various parts of the brain. Those we refer to as the ascending tracts. Ascending tracts. Most of the ascending tracts are actually sensory. Sensory information going to the various parts of the brain, and then the descending tracts from the brain to the spinal cord, those ones are motor. Where they terminate within the brain, parts of the brain, now carries from the spinal cord, and where they terminate is now
Anajua classic alafu
suffix.
Shida na-
Put it that way.
If
If you talk of spinocerebellar tracts, these are fibers originating from the spinal cord, and they terminate
Sorry.
in the cerebellum. The cerebellum, remember, these are through the superior pendangle. They terminate in the cerebellum, spinocerebellar tracts. So these are ascending fibers. Corticospinal tract. These originate from the cerebral cortex, terminate in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So these ones are motor because they are descending from the cortical part of the spinal cord. And if we go to the spinal cord, we'll see a lateral corticospinal tract almost in the same area like what you have in the spinal cord. So this is what we are talking about in terms of ascending and descending tracts. But I'd like us also to look at the other components which we talked about earlier in our first slide, where we are talking about the fibers going from the tectospinal, from the tectum to the spinal cord, vestibulospinal, from the vestibular nucleus to the spinal cord, rubrospinal, olivospinal, from the olivary nucleus to the spinal cord, lateral corticospinal, remember this is corticospinal, but within the medulla oblongata, within the brainstem, we still have these corticospinal tracts, lateral corticospinal tract. And then here we have from the, here we have, for example, vestibulospinal tract, spinothalamic tract, what we're talking about, to the thalamus, lateral spinothalamic tract, and so on. These ones are from the spinal cord to the thalamus. These are the fibers we have been talking about earlier as ascending tracts and descending tracts. And these ones are originating from the specific parts of the body carrying sensory information. From the spinal cord, those ones are mainly for sensory, and then the descending ones will be the cortical spinal tracts. Any other question that we have? I just want to show the first slide we had. In this first slide, representing the various parts, spinal olivary. So this part of the spinal cord